Hello and welcome back to the TikATeeMethod. My name is Ron Castonguay, longtime educator, composer, author, conductor, clinician, and performer. In this video today, we are going to be taking what we learned in week 6, what we learned in week 7, and what we learned in week 8, and we are going to be creating a brand new 2-beat musical sight word. So I hope you're going to stick around for the whole video. We're going to get things started right now. Okay, here we are in week 9, and right at the top of the page, you can see our brand new 2-beat musical sight word. We've got the dotted quarter note going to 2/16 notes. Now, how did we get here? Well, through sequential learning, we actually arrived to week 9 very logically. Back in week 6, we had the dotted quarter note to the 8th note. It sounded like this: ta, ti. So we had that downbeat dotted quarter note and that upbeat flagged 8th note that came in on the end of 2 or the end of 4 when we utilized it in common time. Fast forward to week 7, we introduced 2 new 1-beat musical sight words, now incorporating a couple of 16th notes into our patterns. We had this one, Tik-A, and we had this one, Tik-A. Then, last week in week 8, we took the 8th note in each of week 7's motifs and removed it and replaced it with an 8th rest, now creating 2 new 1-beat musical sight words. They sounded like this: Tik-A, or Tik-A. So here we are at week 9. Now we're coming back to a 2-beat musical sight word, taking what we've learned in week 6, week 7, and week 8, and creating this new musical sight word. So we're going to dive into these diagrams right now and explain it a little bit further. I want to start out by reviewing the verbiage for the TikATeeMethod related to our pattern today. So we know that in the TikATeeMethod, a quarter note or longer is going to be ta, and it's going to be held for a specified value based upon the time signature. So a quarter note, dotted quarter note, half note, dotted half note, whole note, so forth and so on, all of those longer notes are going to be ta. And in our case here, nothing is different. We've got a dotted quarter note that will be ta. The second part of our pattern, these 2/16 notes right here, are indeed the last 2/16 notes in our 4/16 note pattern. And we'll talk about the math of that in a second. But we have Tik-A. If I take off the first 2, I still have Tik-A. One of the nice things about this method is that my 4/16 notes don't have 4 different syllables. Ta-ka, di, mi, one, ni, and da. All of those methods work for certain people, but I needed a method that worked across all the ensembles and music theory and so forth and so on that was a little more simple for my students to wrap their heads around more quickly, so that vocalizing rhythms weren't tongue twisters and didn't become obstacles at faster tempos, for example. So by having Tik-A, it really makes a lot of logical sense to me to have the first 2 be the same as the last 2. So in this pattern here, it is the last 2/16 notes in our 4/16 note pattern, which is, of course, Tik-A, just like that, okay? So if we were to say this rhythm, it sounds like this: ta, Tik-A, ta, Tik-A, ta, Tik-A. There was 2 consecutive in a row, an entire 4/4 measure. So let's dive a little bit into these diagrams and see how the math works for our 2-beat musical sight word this week. I'm actually going to start with illustration B in this case because I think it makes the most sense in relation to a previous rhythm we've already done. Back in week 6, we had the dotted quarter note to the 8th note rhythm. It sounded like this in a full measure: ta, ti, ta, ti. So we have this dotted quarter note coming in on the downbeat of 1. We have this augmentation dot next to our quarter note, which takes half the value of the original note and adds it to itself. We can think of that dot as beat 2 in this case, and then this 8th note as the upbeat of beat 2. Well, what I've done is I've taken this 8th note and I've replaced it with 2/16 notes. 1/8 note is equal to 2/16 notes and vice versa. And then I've taken this dotted quarter note and just brought it right down into our pattern. So we still have the dotted quarter note, but on that upbeat now, instead of a single flagged 8th note, we have 2/16 notes. So in 4/4 time, a full measure of this new pattern sounds like this: ta, Tik-A, ta, Tik-A. Okay, so I hope that makes sense, and I hope you can see why I started with illustration B. It just makes the most sense in relation to a previous rhythm that we've already learned back in week 6. Illustration A talks a little bit more about the math behind this motif, so let's talk about that right now. Illustration A really just talks about the math behind this rhythmic motif. So what I've done is I've taken 6/16 notes here being boxed, and I combined them together to create a dotted quarter note. So for you math folks out there, stay with me. A quarter note is equal to 4/16 notes. An eighth note is equal to 2/16 notes. Well, if we think about the math behind a dotted quarter note, isn't it just a quarter note plus an eighth note? Well, if we broke down that quarter note and that eighth note, 4/16 notes, 2/16 notes, 4 plus 2 equals 6. That's where I got the box of 6/16 notes to create one dotted quarter note. And then these last two remaining 16th notes just come right down into our musical pattern. So there's a lot of math behind rhythm, and it's okay to break it down this way because it can only help us as we move into more complex rhythmic patterns and different time signatures down the road. So combining math with music or math with rhythm makes a lot of sense, and it's okay, and we'll talk through it by way of these diagrams. But now that we have talked through it, now is the time we need to put it into practice and go try some exercises. I hope you'll join me. Let's go to exercise 9A right now. All right, here we are at exercise 9A, and just as in previous videos, I'm going to go beat by beat, measure by measure, and analyze this exercise. Afterwards, we'll perform it with a metronome. But before we do that, I want to talk about a concept I mentioned in last week's video, and that concept is compartmentalization. Now, that's a big word, but simply put, what it means is breaking things down into small, manageable pieces so that we can better comprehend or perform more complex concepts or ideas. For example, and I use this example with my students, back in the day when we used to memorize phone numbers, have you ever really thought about a phone number? It's 10 digits long. If somebody just gave you 10 random numbers next to each other, 0 through 9, and you had to memorize that phone number, you'd have a much more difficult time than if somebody said, here's the area code, here's the prefix, and let's call the last 4 digits the suffix. That's how our human brains break down phone numbers. That's how we had a much more manageable time memorizing phone numbers. Memorizing 10 digits versus memorizing an area code, a prefix, and a suffix. The difference there is huge. Well, this is where our spoken language and sight words come into play. It's the same thing when we were learning our language. Sight words is a form of or an example of compartmentalization. In rhythm, we have compartmentalization all over the place. And here's how I want to apply compartmentalization to today's exercises. I want us to start thinking about 1 and 2 beat musical sight words. So I want us to start thinking about a single 4/4 measure as this: 2 beats, an invisible bar line, and then 2 beats. Can we begin to conceptualize or visualize, compartmentalize each of our 4/4 measures into halves? 2, invisible bar line, 2. So I'm going to go through this exercise right now and find where the invisible bar line is in all 8 of these measures. I hope you'll join me, and let's see if we can do this together. Starting with measure 1, we can see a familiar rhythm right away. We've got the dotted quarter note to the 8th note rhythm back from week 6. We know that that takes up 2 beats. Then immediately following that, we have week 9's rhythmic motif. There it is, the dotted quarter note to 2/16 notes. So here we have it in measure 1, a 2-beat musical sight word followed by another 2-beat musical sight word. That makes finding the invisible bar line right in the center pretty easy, and I'll use a dotted line to represent that invisible bar line. If we can start seeing 4/4 measures like this, you will much more manageably wrap your head around rhythmic concepts. Moving on to measure 2. Here it is again, week 6's rhythm. We know that the dotted quarter note to 8th note is a 2-beat rhythm. The half note gets 2 beats, so our invisible bar line in measure 2 is pretty easy to locate. Measure 3, I've got a quarter rest and a quarter note. those combined equal 2 beats. And then we have week 9's motif finishing off that measure, and that gets 2 beats. So we have the invisible bar line right here. Now, in the fourth measure, I want to talk about this for a second, because finding the invisible bar line in the fourth measure is going to be tricky. Now, there is another way that the last measure could be written. You could have a quarter note to another quarter note tied to a half note. The reason that I didn't do that here in week 9 is because I haven't yet introduced ties as a concept, as a rhythmic concept yet. It comes a little later in the book. So the invisible bar line here is actually going to be in the middle of this dotted half note. It's going to be somewhere in there. And I'm going to get more into that later. But if you just look at that measure, and I'll erase that measure real quick here just so that you can see it. You've got 1 beat, and then you've got this one that's lasting 3 beats. So we could actually think of this being a musical sight word and this being a musical sight word, and just thinking of it in that manner. There's 2 different ways that we can conceptualize that last measure. Either way, we're breaking it down into more manageable pieces. So I hope this makes sense. Let's move to the second line. Moving on to measure 5 in the second line, we've got a quarter note followed by an 8th rest and 2 16th notes. And we recognize that from week 8's video. We've got the upbeat 16th notes. And we know that that's a 1-beat musical sight word. These 2 items combined equal 2 beats. The next thing we have is week 9's motif, the dotted quarter note to 2 16th notes, and we know that that also equals 2 beats. So if I erase this square and this circle real quick, I'm going to squeeze my invisible bar line in right here. 2 beats, invisible bar line, 2 beats. Moving on to measure 6, I've got an 8th note and an 8th rest, followed again by my 8th rest and 2 16th note pattern from last week. These 2 items combined, 2 beats long. Then we have week 6's pattern, the dotted quarter note to the 8th note. That is also a 2-beat rhythmic motif. So let me erase this square and this circle so that we can squeeze in our invisible bar line right here, right before that dotted quarter note 8th note pattern. Moving to the 7th measure, we have a quarter note and a quarter rest. We know that those 2 things combined equal 2 beats, followed by a quarter rest and a quarter note. Again, 2 beats combined. So our invisible bar line in measure 7 is a little easier to find. It's right there in the center. Moving on to the final measure, we have week 9's motif, the dotted quarter note to 2 16th notes, which we know is a 2-beat musical sight word, followed by a half note, which is 2 beats long. So our invisible bar line will squeeze right in the middle there. So I hope this is starting to make sense. We're taking 4/4 time, we're taking common time, and we're compartmentalizing it into manageable, digestible pieces. A lot of times, beginning sight readers will see an entire measure, for example, and become overwhelmed. But as soon as you ask them to see half of a measure, it becomes a little bit easier to see. And this is how we want to compartmentalize common time moving forward. And this is going to help us when we get into more complex rhythms and we get into more complex time signatures down the road. Okay, I'm going to erase this ink and just go through a few more quick items before we perform it. So stay with me. Since I've analyzed exercise 9A pretty much in its entirety, there are just a couple more things I want to bring to your attention. So let me erase the ink that's on here, and I want you to look at measure 5. Notice the similarity between the rhythm on beats 1 and 2 and the rhythm on beats 3 and 4. And you'll see there that they both have a long note to start and then 2 16th notes to end that come in on upbeats. They are very, very similar rhythms. The difference lies in this 8th rest right here, which means that we need to have silence before those 2 16th note upbeats. Whereas in this dotted quarter note rhythm right here, it's going to be continual all the way until those 2 16th notes. So if I'm to perform just the first 2 beats right here, this is what it would sound like. Ta, Tik-A, ta, Tik-A. And what I would tell my students is, I would tell them to write -2 over that 8th rest so that they hold that quarter note full value, but stop the sound on beat 2 so that we can have a brief moment, an 8th rest worth of silence before those 2 16th notes come in. contrary to that, on the next two beats, beats 3 and 4, this one right here, that dotted quarter note is going to be continually sounded all the way until the 2/16 notes. It'll sound like this. Ta, Tik-A, ta, Tik-A. It continues all the way. There is no break. There is no rest. So why am I bringing this to your attention? Because it's really important as musicians that we notice these subtle differences in rhythm. And the subtle difference between beats 1 and 2 versus beats 3 and 4 is really important and could make all the difference in the world in a musical phrase. So in context. Okay? So that's the first thing I want to bring to your attention. The next thing I want to bring to your attention before we actually go and perform this exercise is right in the next measure, measure 6. You'll notice that there are 2 eighth rests right here in that measure. Now, this exact question came up in a recent class of mine where we had a similar exercise, and the student asked, why can't we just take those 2 eighth rests and make it a quarter rest? Wouldn't that be easier? Well, mathematically, I could write eighth note, quarter rest, 2/16 notes. Mathematically, that works. But musically, and as you're performing, I cannot easily decipher beat 1 and beat 2. So the answer lies in the compartmentalization of all of the beats. We want to easily decipher beat 1 from beat 2, beat 2 from beat 3, and beat 3 from beat 4. We want to also, as often as we can, easily decipher beats 1 and 2 from beats 3 and 4. A larger form of compartmentalization, which is what we just did by finding the invisible bar lines. So if I was to put a box around each of the beats in measure 6, it would look like this. Beat 1 would be here, and beat 2 would be here. So in and of themselves, we can see those beats very clearly. Now, it just so happens that there are 2 eighth rests next to each other. But it needs to be 2 eighth rests next to each other so that we can easily decipher beat 1, which is the eighth note eighth rest, from beat 2, which is the eighth rest and 2/16 notes. So I can easily see now that this is beat 1 and this is beat 2. The other way, if we had an eighth note and then a quarter rest and then 2/16 notes, that would be very confusing visually, and you would stumble if you were sight reading over that. So we want to make sure that we can decipher all of the beats, especially in common time when we're just learning how to understand rhythms and understand time signatures and read music notation. We want to make sure we can decipher all the beats. So a long-winded answer, that's why those 2 eighth rests cannot be turned into a quarter rest. But we want to make sure when we're looking at measures like these, we don't get confused when we see 2 eighth rests next to each other. We can analyze it correctly and appropriately, and maybe that's something we want to draw our attention to in the 20 or 30 seconds when we're analyzing an exercise, which, let's face it, we're spending a lot more time than that analyzing these exercises in these videos, but ultimately you should be taking 10, 20, 30 seconds tops looking over these 8 measure exercises before you actually attempt them with a metronome, which is what we're finally going to do right now. So I hope you'll join me. Let's perform 9A together. All right, the first thing I'm going to do is erase all this ink so you can see the exercise a little more clearly. You'll also notice that the Tik-A-Tee verbiage is included in this one for a little added assistance. And for a 3rd week in a row, I am using the metronome from violinlounge.com. Thank you again to those folks for offering up a free metronome. All right, let's get our metronome clicking here at 74 beats per minute, or the quarter note equals 74. We are then going to give you a G3, which is the pitch that I'll be singing. You can join me on this pitch, sing it an octave higher, an octave lower, or a totally different note altogether. Totally up to you, but we're going to start. Here we go. 1, 2, ready, and ta, ti, ta, Tik-A, ta, ti, ta. Ta, ta, Tik-A, ta, 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 Tik-A, ta, Tik-A-Tee, Tik-A, ta, ti, ta, 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 Tik-A, ta. stop the metronome. All right, hopefully you heard me hold notes out full value. You could hear what I did in measure 5 with that silence that cut off on beat 2. I observed that eighth rest there. Okay, so we performed it. Now we need to go listen to the MP3 for reference. And as I've said before, music is a language. It should be taught like a language. Well, a big part of learning language is listening. That's why there are 363 MP3s with my book. It is very important that you listen to the exercises so you can hear them performed accurately and to make sure that we performed it accurately ourselves. So let's go to the MP3 for exercise 9A right now. All right, here we are at my website where you can find all of the MP3s, and we are at week 9. We're about to press play on exercise A. Here are your 3 options. You can just listen and check for your accuracy in that manner. Option 2, you can vocalize and sing along with the MP3. Or option 3, if your instrument isn't the voice and you play another instrument, please break that instrument out now and you can play along with the MP3. So without further ado, here is exercise 9A. One, two, three, 4. Ta, ti, ta, tika, ta, ti, ta. Ta, ta, tika, ta, 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 tika, ta, tika, ti, tika, ta, ti, ta, 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 tika, ta. All right, so hopefully you checked for your accuracy. You know that the final and most crucial step of this is to make sure that after you've analyzed, after you've vocalized, after you've checked it against the MP3, that you do perform these exercises on your instrument. And speaking of that, I had a little more fun this week with my tenor sax and some Logic Pro loops and some different harmonies beneath it. And I used the blues scale again, the B-flat blues scale, and the rhythms from exercise 9A to come up with a little solo. So here it is. I hope you enjoy. One, two, three, 4. All right, let's move on to exercise 9B. Now, I'm going to go through this and analyze it one measure, one beat at a time. But while I'm doing that, I'm going to find the invisible bar line. So here we go. Let's start with measure 1. We've got a quarter note here on beat 1, a quarter note on beat 2. So we've got our invisible bar line happening right here. Then on beats 3 and 4, we've got our dotted quarter note, eighth note rhythm from week 6, right? So we recognize that right away. Here we go. In the next measure, we have our week 9 rhythm, which is beats 1 and 2. So the invisible bar line is going to go right here. Beats 3, Tik-A, Tik-A, ta, beat 4. In measure 3, we have again a dotted half note on 1, 2, and 3 with a quarter note on beat 4. Now, I mentioned this from 9A. Since I haven't introduced ties yet, our invisible bar line is going to be in the middle of this dotted half note. If I was to use a tie, I would have a half note tied to a quarter note, and then have this last quarter note on beat 4, and the invisible bar line would go right there. But since I don't have that, it's a little more difficult, if you will, to find that invisible bar line. But in the beginning stages of reading rhythms, dotted half notes are easier to understand, believe it or not, than ties are, which is why I introduced ties later in my book. Moving to measure 4, we've got week 9's rhythm right here. So we know that takes up 2 beats. So our invisible bar line is going to go right here. And then we've got this half note on beats 3 and 4. What should we be doing on beats 3 and 4? we should be looking ahead while that's happening, especially when we're switching lines. You're going to hear me say it video after video. Look ahead when you're sight reading. All right, moving to measure 5 in the second line here, we have beat 1, TT, beat 2, Tik-A, and then beats 3 and 4 will be week 6's rhythmic motif. There it is. So our invisible bar line is going to split that measure right in half. Measure 6, we have week 9's rhythm here. Then we have a quarter note on beat 3 and a quarter rest on beat 4. We know that our invisible bar line is going to go right here because our week 9's rhythmic motif lasts for 2 beats. 2 beats, invisible bar line, 2 beats. Measure 7, rest on beat 1. TT on beat 2, invisible bar line right here. Then beats 3 and 4, there it is, week 9's rhythmic motif. So that's going to take up 2 beats. And then in the last measure, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, on a whole note, do we need to find the invisible bar line? Well, here's one of the exceptions to the rules. If you see a whole note in 4/4, that's pretty easy to digest right away. You know it's going to be a note that's going to last the entire 4 beats in common time. There's no need to compartmentalize or find the invisible bar line in a measure that has a whole note. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. I would definitely tell my students, however, to write -1 there so that we hold that whole note out all the way to the end. It would sound like this. Ta, release, right there, okay? So we've analyzed it, we found the invisible bar lines, we recognized a lot of our week 9 patterns here in exercise 9B. Now let's go perform it with a metronome. The first thing I want to do is erase all this ink so you can see the exercise more clearly, and you'll see for exercise 9B again, I've included the TikATeeMethod verbiage for a little added assistance. All right, let's get our metronome started. We're remaining at 74 beats per minute, or the quarter note equals 74. Here is the note I'll be singing, a G3. And here comes the count off. 1, 2, ready, and ta, 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 ti, ta, ticka, 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 ta, 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 ticka, ta, ti, ti, ticka, ticka, ta, ti, ta, ticka, ta. Ti, ti, ta, ticka, ta. All right, stop the metronome. Hopefully you heard that I held out the note's full value, but there were a couple times in there I needed to breathe. There weren't many rests in this exercise, and I can't hold my breath forever. So I had to cut a couple notes off a little short just to breathe. But the important thing is that I maintained the integrity of the written rhythms. Or maybe I didn't. I don't know. How do we check? We go to the MP3 for exercise 9B, so let's go do that right now. All right, here we are again at my website where you can find all of the MP3s that accompany my book. We're about to press play on exercise 9B. You need to first decide which of the 3 options you are choosing. Are you just going to listen to the MP3 and check for your accuracy in that manner? Or option 2, are you going to sing along and vocalize the rhythms with the MP3? Or option 3, are you going to play your instrument with the MP3, especially if your instrument isn't primarily the voice? So without further ado, here is exercise 9B. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ta, 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 ti, ta, ticka, 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 ta, 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 ticka, ta, ti, ti, ticka, ticka, ta, ti, ta, ticka, ta. Ti, ti, ta, ticka, ta. All right, there's exercise 9B. You probably heard a couple of times in there where I had to cut some notes off a little shorter than I would want to, but I had to breathe and still maintain the integrity of the rhythm. Okay, so the crucial step, here it is. We're at it. We need to perform these exercises on our instruments. We analyze first, we vocalize second, we check it against the MP3 third, and then the final step is to perform it on our instrument, especially if it's not the voice. I had a little more fun with my tenor sax. I created another groove with some harmony beneath it, and using the rhythms from exercise 9B and notes from the B-flat blues scale, I created a little solo for my tenor sax. So here it is. Hope you enjoy. One, two, three, four. All right, that does it for week 9. Thank you so much for joining me all the way to the end of this video. I really appreciate your support, and I do truly hope that these videos are helping you on your rhythmic journey to sight reading fluency. After all, that is the point. Here in week 9, we introduced you to a new 2-beat musical sight word, the dotted quarter note to the 2/16 notes. We also dove a little bit more deeply into the idea of compartmentalization and that concept of the invisible bar line, dividing our 4/4 measures directly in half. Can we decipher beat 1 from beat 2? Can we decipher beats 1 and 2 from beats 3 and 4? Are we beginning to understand the concept a little more deeply of 1-beat and 2-beat musical sight words? These are all really important concepts and are cumulative as we move on to the next week, which is our first double-digit week as we move into week 10 in the next video. I do hope you'll check out my book, Rhythmic Sight Reading, the TikATeeMethod. These videos are only intended to be supplemental to the amount of material and exercises that are in the book. You can find my book at roncastingway.com. You can also find it at Amazon and at jwpepper.com. And don't forget to check out my store, Ron Castingway Music, on Amazon. Lots of great resources for music educators and students alike. And please help me out with the YouTube algorithm and subscribe to this channel right now. Hit like on that button and that notification bell and leave a comment as well. I'm going to answer all comments that are down there. So please leave a comment if you are inspired to do so. Again, thank you for your support, and we'll see you in the next double-digit video for week 10.